Not long ago, I spent most of the day at home reading. The book was The Technological Republic by Alexander C. Karp and Nicholas W. Zamiska. A friend recommended it to me, and I actually found it quite good. At first, I thought I was just reading a book about AI and national power, but after a few chapters, two older books started coming back to me: Niall Ferguson's Empire and Kenneth Pomeranz's The Great Divergence. That is usually how I know a book is doing something to me. It does not just give me new information, it wakes up old shelves. Karp, of course, is the co founder and CEO of Palantir. Many people outside the worlds of AI, defense technology, or enterprise software may not know Palantir very well. It is a major American software and data analytics company deeply involved in government, defense, intelligence, and enterprise data systems. Its market value is well above $100 billion. The Palantir co-founder is often described as a hawkish figure from Silicon Valley. That description is interesting because Silicon Valley usually speaks in a very different register. It sits in one of the bluest parts of America, and its public culture often leans toward a kind of liberal internationalism. A lot of founders and technology executives like to talk about openness, access, empowerment, global connectivity, lowering barriers, giving people a voice. I do not mean that as an insult. That language is part of what made Silicon Valley powerful. It gave technology a moral story. But when I read Karp, I do not hear that old Silicon Valley story. I hear something harder. I hear him saying, stop talking about AI as if it is only another app, another chatbot, another productivity tool. In the hands of a state, AI becomes power. That is the edge of the book. The author is not saying technology naturally makes the world flatter or more peaceful. He is saying artificial intelligence may intensify geopolitical competition. The next stage of national power will depend on compute, models, data infrastructure, robotics, multimodal systems, and the ability to integrate all of that into military, industrial, and institutional capacity. So when I read him, I do not hear optimism. I hear anxiety. Not weak anxiety, not panic, more like strategic anxiety. The kind of anxiety that says, if we do not build, coordinate, and defend, someone else will. In the Technological Republic, Karp argues that the United States has entered a dangerous moment. China is now competing very closely with America in artificial intelligence, large models, compute, multimodal systems, humanoid robots, industrial applications. In some areas, China may even be moving faster than Americans like to admit. Karp sees this as one of the most serious technological challenges facing America since World War II. I do not know if I agree with his entire mood. There is something almost too warlike in it. But I also cannot dismiss it, because when he says AI will be absorbed into national power, he is probably closer to reality than the older Silicon Valley fantasy that technology simply makes the world open and flat. The part of the book that stayed with me was not only the China argument, it was Karp's nostalgia for a certain American machine. Not nostalgia in the sentimental sense, more like nostalgia for execution. He wants America to recover something like its Cold War model of technological seriousness. During the Cold War, the United States did not build strategic technologies through the market alone. It built them through a triangle: government, universities, and private industry. The Manhattan Project created the atomic bomb. The Apollo program took the United States to the moon. The Strategic Defense Initiative, later nicknamed Star Wars, became one of the symbolic defense projects of the late Cold War. And ARPANET, funded by ARPA, which later became DARPA, became one of the foundations of the Internet. What interests Karp is not just the names of these projects, it is the machinery behind them: government money, university research, private engineering, military urgency. Karp wants that machinery back. In Chinese terms, you could call it concentrating resources to accomplish great tasks. The United States brought together the military, academia, and private technology companies to compete with the Soviet Union across nuclear weapons, aerospace, missile defense, and information networks. And in the long run, that combination became one of the reasons America won the Cold War. When I look at the US China competition today, I can see why Karp reaches for that analogy. The fields have changed, but not completely. Military technology is still there. Space and aerospace are still there. Information technology is still there. The old internet era has now evolved into the age of artificial intelligence. So when I look at the subtitle, Hard Power, Soft Belief, and the Future of the West, I understand why the book feels almost like a manifesto. Karp does not believe technology automatically brings peace. He believes technology may bring confrontation, and America may need to rebuild a Cold War style technology coalition to survive the AI age. I kept thinking about that word, coalition, not just innovation, not just startups, not just venture capital, a coalition, a society deciding that some technologies are so important that the state, universities, companies, and citizens all have to take them seriously. That is a very different idea from the consumer internet mood I grew up with. And that is when Ferguson came back to me. The book was Empire, The Rise and Demise of the British World Order and the Lessons for Global Power by Niall Ferguson. Ferguson is one of the most widely read historians in the English-speaking world. Before Empire, the British historian had already written major works on finance, power, and empire, including his two-volume study of the Rothschild family, the House of Rothschild. I thought of Ferguson because he was also asking America an uncomfortable question. He was not writing about AI, he was writing about empire. But when I went back to Empire, I was struck by how direct the warning was. Ferguson was basically telling America, you already have imperial power, but you do not want to admit what that requires. He wrote Empire in the early 2000s, after moving from Britain to teach at Harvard. In some sense, it was a book addressed to the American intellectual world. His argument was that since the Industrial Revolution, the greatest empire had been the British Empire. Britain's empire was built through military power, trade, finance, migration, and colonial rule across the world. It became the empire on which, as the saying goes, the sun never set. But by the early 21st century, Britain was no longer the central power of the Western world. That role had passed to America, and Ferguson's criticism was sharp. America had become a kind of empire, but it had not fully accepted the responsibilities of empire. I remember this because it has the same emotional shape as Karp's book, different subject, same unease. Ferguson looked at American power and worried that America did not want to understand what it had become. Karp looks at American technology and worries that America no longer knows how to organize power seriously. The language is different, the technology is different, but the anxiety is related. Does the West still have the will, the belief, and the institutional seriousness to defend itself? Ferguson also came to mind for another reason. Around 2008, he visited China. That was the year of the Beijing Olympics, and also the year America was entering the global financial crisis. He went to Beijing, then Shanghai, Shenzhen, Xi'an, and later Yan'an. In Civilization, the West, and the Rest, published in 2011, he wrote, in effect, that walking along dusty roads in China made him feel that 500 years of Western dominance might be coming to an end. I would not say Ferguson was the first Western scholar to think this. That would be too strong. But he was one of the more prominent Western historians to frame China's rise not just as an economic story, but as a deeper challenge to Western dominance. So when I read Karp's anxiety about AI and China, Ferguson's older anxiety about empire came back naturally. Then I thought of a third book, Kenneth Pomeranz's The Great Divergence, China, Europe, and the making of the modern world economy. Pomeranz is a historian now at the University of Chicago after many years at UC Irvine. The Great Divergence was published in 2000, and it changed the way many people thought about the economic divergence between China and Western Europe. I thought of Pomeranz for a different reason. Ferguson gives me the question of empire, Karp gives me the question of technological power. Pomeranz gives me the older question underneath both. Why do different parts of the world move through the same historical transformation in different ways? The Great Divergence asks why Western Europe, especially Britain, broke away economically from other advanced parts of Eurasia after the Industrial Revolution. Why did China, which had once been one of the largest and most sophisticated economies in the world, fall behind in the modern industrial age? But the economic historian is not telling a simple story where Europe was always dynamic and China was always stagnant. That is why the book matters. Pomeranz compares the most developed parts of China and Western Europe before the Industrial Revolution and argues that the gap was not as obvious or as ancient as older narratives assumed. The divergence came later, and it had a lot to do with material conditions: coal, ecological pressure, land constraints, overseas resources, and the way regional economies connected to global trade. His argument is not mainly cultural, it is about economic history, energy, ecology, and the global conditions that allowed Britain and Western Europe to break through certain constraints, while China did not do so in the same way. When I put that next to Karp, I do not think these two authors are saying the same thing. They are not, but Pomeranz reminds me that technology never enters an empty world. It enters geography, it enters institutions, it enters energy systems, it enters states, it enters histories of defeat and power. China entered industrial modernity very differently from Britain. Britain entered from a position of power. China entered through defeat, through the Opium Wars, through military humiliation, through the burning of the old summer palace, through repeated confrontations with Western powers. So when AI arrives today, I do not think the real question is simply who has the better model. The question is what kind of society the model enters, what kind of state uses it, what kind of industrial system absorbs it, what kind of historical memory gives it meaning. That is why Karp made me think of Ferguson and Pomeranz, not because the three books are the same, they are not, but because together they helped me see the current U.S. China technology competition on a longer timeline. Karp gives me the present danger, Ferguson gives me the imperial anxiety, Pomeranz gives me the historical depth. And then there is AI itself, not as the subject of the books, but as part of my reading process. When I started reading The Technological Republic, one of the first things I did was ask a chatbot what the book was about. It gave me a quick summary of the main argument. Then I picked out the parts I wanted to focus on. For example, Karp's discussion of how American technology companies, universities, and the Department of Defense worked together during the Cold War. That was an area I did not know especially well, so I used AI to get an initial map. And for someone like me, a fairly old-fashioned long-time reader, that is one of the real benefits of AI. It gives me a first map. It helps me locate the background, the key names, the historical references, and the parts where I may want to slow down, but it does not replace reading. What it changes is the entrance. This distinction matters to me. If I only ask the chatbot for a summary, I get information. But if I read Karp and then Ferguson comes back to me, and then I pull Pomeranz from the shelf, and then the three books start speaking to each other in my head, that is not the chatbot doing the reading for me. That comes from years of reading, years of forgetting, years of remembering, years of carrying questions that suddenly become useful again. AI can get me into a book faster, but it cannot know why Ferguson comes back to me when I am reading Karp. It cannot feel the old book waking up on the shelf. that part still belongs to the reader. So, no, I do not think reading is over in the age of AI. If anything, AI makes the difference between shallow reading and deep reading more obvious. If all you want is a summary, the machine can give you that very quickly. But if you want connections, real connections, across books, memory, history, and your own accumulated questions, you still have to read. You still have to live with books long enough for them to come back later. That is what happened to me with the Technological Republic. I thought I was reading one book about AI and national power, but it pulled two other books back into the room. And once those books were in the room, I had a longer, deeper way of thinking about the US China technology competition. That, to me, is still one of the most interesting things about reading today. The world may be chaotic, but the mind can remain steady. No matter how far artificial intelligence develops, it did not stop me from spending a day with a book. And because of that book, it led me back to other books. That is the strange and valuable thing about reading now. And maybe this episode is also a small opening for something I want to discuss more seriously in the next few episodes. As Trump is expected to visit Beijing soon, I think it is worth slowing down before the headlines arrive. Because if we only watch the visit as a diplomatic event, we may miss the deeper question. What kind of competition is this? Is it a normal great power rivalry? Is it a new Cold War? Or is it something stranger? Two enormous systems trying to absorb the same technologies into very different political, industrial, and historical structures. Last but not least, thank you for being interested in this topic. If this episode gave you a different way to think about AI, reading, or the US China competition, subscribe, like, and share. And I want to know what you think. When you look at the current US China relationship, do you see a new Cold War, a temporary rivalry, or something that does not quite fit the old categories? And before Trump goes to Beijing, what do you think matters most? Trade, AI, chips, Taiwan, supply chains, or the deeper question of whether the two systems can still understand each other? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you in the next one.